Hello and welcome to rePRO Film Festival by mama.film. I am Debbie Samples.
I'm Leila Meadow-Connor.
And I'm Mallory Martin.
As the founders of rePRO, we want to thank the village of people who have made this festival possible, our filmmakers, special guests, partners, sponsors, and of course, our audience. You have lent your time, talents, and expertise to help amplify the voices that are so crucial in the fight for reproductive justice and bodily autonomy.
When you purchase tickets and donate to rePRO, you've become an active participant of change, as all net ticket sales and accompanying donations support our 5 beneficiary organizations.
We thank you for participating in these vitally important call to action conversations and hope you leave feeling empowered to be your own advocate in the world. Please keep women's reproductive rights at the forefront of your mind as we enter this critical election season. We're pleased to present the Get Cliterate call to action conversation, moderated by Twanna Hines, the funky brown chick.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Twanna Hines, and I'm moderating a fantastic conversation called Get Cliterate. I'm a theater performing artist and an entrepreneur. Some of you may know me by the moniker Funky Brown Chick. Funky like quirky, brown like the color, chick, truth in advertising. That's my moniker, that's the name of my company. Super excited to be here, and I am joined by 3 fantastic humans to have a conversation about gender and desire. And so we've got Maria Finitzo, who is, I'm assuming, Italian by heritage. I love that name. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. Maria is the director of the feature documentary, The Dilemma of Desire, and a lot of the conversation will center around that. So if you haven't seen the film, you're going to want to. And we'll post a link in the Twitter chat, so you'll see how you can see that. So we've got Maria Finitzo with us. We also have Sophia Wallace, who is an amazing visual artist and subject in the Dilemma of Desire. And then we also have Dr. Stacey Dutton, who is an assistant professor of biology, and she too is the subject of the Dilemma of Desire. So super excited to have everyone here. And you know who else is here? The most important ones. The audience, you. If you have questions, make sure that you drop those in the Q&A. We're Facebook live streaming, we're Zoom live streaming, we're on Twitter with the hashtag get. See, I already want to say clit. I can't stop myself. Get Cliterate. Get Cliterate is the hashtag. So any of those, you can drop some questions. They will feed back to us, and we can send them to these fantastic panelists here. And last but absolutely not least, super excited that we have an interpreter tonight. Always, always, always fantastic to have access for deaf and hard of hearing communities. As a hard of hearing person myself, I am biased and really, really love this very much so when people do this. Do this if you organize panels. All right, let's get this started right away. So, if you've seen the film, you know that it starts off with Stacey. You know, she and I go by Stacey. You may have to call her Dr. Dutton. But Stacey is looking for the clitoris, like searching for it. Not on her body. Stacey is looking in this book called Grey's Anatomy, which you may have heard of because of the television show, which is based on an actual book by that name. And Stacey can't find it, really. Can't find it. It's not really there. And so I want Stacey to tell us more about its absence and what that means for biology. Stacey, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I am a teacher, right? So I'm an academic, and by that, I teach a lot of courses on human anatomy and physiology. And one of the things when I started down the road of becoming interested in female sexual pleasure, or just sexual pleasure in general, I was kind of struck that the images of the clitoris in my textbooks were outdated, and sometimes they weren't there. And when they were there, there was no consistency between textbooks. And so because of that, I was like, okay, well, let me just get the first textbook on, like the first medical book that was, published on the human body, right? Grey's Anatomy. So I got an abridged version of the text via Amazon, right? Everybody's favorite place these days. So, it came, and I'm looking, through the text. I go to the back, clitoris, okay, it's in like the little glossary, but I cannot find it on the page in which they said it's supposed to be. And so it's believed that the clitoris was actually like intentionally removed from Grey's Anatomy at that point in time. Like obviously, misogyny, right? but it was intentionally removed during that given time. And so then the second part of your question was, what does that mean for biology, right? So what that means for biology is that people who are being educated on anatomy are not being educated on the anatomy that is specific for people with clitorises. They're not. Like, that is being let out of the information. But even from like an academic perspective, that's that, right? Because not everybody who decides to study biology goes on to deal with humans. But if you decide to go to medical school, like, that's where it becomes a real issue, because now you are practicing medicine and you're giving care to individuals. So what does that look like when your physician or your OBGYN has no idea like what the true workings of the clitoris looks like? What is the consequences of that, right? Like, what are the end results of that? And say if a woman has to have some sort of surgery, or a person who has a clitoris has to have some sort of surgery in that area, right? What happens if you damage those tissues, right? No one knows of these things, but I'm certain the people who are dealing with the traumatic effects of having physicians who have lack of understanding of the clitoris are dealing with the long-term effects of just not even being able to experience sexual pleasure. So that's like the real thing, right? Biologists don't really care about sex sometimes, right? Like, really don't. Which is crazy, right? But I mean, even as I'm a biologist, like at the core of it, but I'm a neuroscientist at my real training. But like when I talk about what I do, it's always like, oh, okay, you study sex, like they run away. But it's really the medical community that really needs to get it together and address this issue, because they're treating patients. They have an ethical obligation. They have a legal obligation to make sure that they know these things so that the persons that they're treating can get appropriate care.
Yeah, that's so true. I'm a sex educator, so all of my theater is about sex. It's using theater as an entryway to get people into it. So my writing, my teaching, my speaking is all about sex. So getting people to be more comfortable about this conversation. So Stacey, if I remember correctly, you went looking for a clitoris. You wanted to see this gorgeous, delicious thing. And where did that lead you? Where did that lead you, Stacey?
Well, it didn't lead me nowhere with that book. Nowhere there, because it wasn't there. Like, the words, the image, right? But a penis was there. Oh, a penis was absolutely there with all of its details, but accent.
Absolutely. So I think this is a good segue to talk about like the importance of all the different fields and how everybody contributes when it comes to sex, this wonderful, fascinating, multidisciplinary subject. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Sophia. Sophia, which is a fantastic name as well. Everybody here has beautiful names. Sophia, can you tell me a little bit about the work that you do and what exactly is the clitoris for people who may not have heard of it?
Oh my goodness. Well, I have been working for 8 years on this project called Cliterate. And the project, it really started out just out of complete shock and awe that, at the time, I believe I was 32 years old, and I was just finding out myself what the true anatomy of the clitoris was. And I was pretty dumbfounded, particularly as someone who, attended a women's college, had multiple books about the vulva and its anatomy, and I was always interested in this area, so I was like completely floored that I didn't know the true anatomy of my own body. And I was also thinking a lot about sex, and I was like, the representation of sex, and how is it possible that we're not seeing the clitoris as being a primary protagonist in like any representation of sex that includes somebody who has a clitoris? Like, it's just never there. And I was like, this is just crazy. This is just embarrassingly not based on reality. And like, how come no one talks about this? So that's kind of where I started. And I wrote 100 natural laws of cliteracy. And that was basically like a universal declaration of rights for the clitoris, saying it has a right to be known in its truth. It has a right to respect. Also, it's so dope. Like, we should celebrate it. People enjoy the fact that they have a penis, and like, not that they shouldn't, but like, clits are amazing too. Some of us are pretty happy that we have a clit, and like, you can have clit envy because they are that amazing. Do you know what I'm saying? So that was also part of it, just giving some kind of swag to the clit, and really, and then, you know, making sculptures, making performances, making street art, just trying in every possible way to connect the dots, because, you know, while sex educators and researchers and feminist anatomists have known a lot about the clitoris for a long time, it has never kind of made it to the mainstream discourse. So it's always been repressed. So it's like, even though that knowledge has been there, for some reason there has been, as Stacey's talking about, this denial to erase it, deny it, hide it, shroud it in secrecy, shame it, make it a taboo to even ever show it or talk about it.
Yeah, so true. Especially as you talk about the need to have this mainstream conversation about the clitoris. The clitoris.
I love it when you're saying it like that. Yeah,
exactly. And we can see the sign too, the clitoris.
Yes.
Clitoris. And so as we talk about the need to have a mainstream conversation about it, I think this is a good time to talk about the role that film plays. So Maria, Finitzo, can you tell us a little bit about the importance that, the important role that film really plays in bringing to light and facilitating the kinds of conversations that need to be had about things like the clitoris?
So absolutely. So I grew up as a kid sitting in darkened movie theaters and watching films. And sometimes I would watch them with an audience, and sometimes there weren't that many people there. But one of the things that was always prevalent was that you were sitting in a space with a group of strangers having a shared emotional experience. And so filmmaking at its best, and we can put aside COVID for a while, what brings people together and gives them a shared emotional experience. They can connect with the stories on the screen. They can all feel the energy in a room. And film is a great way of mobilizing people to come together and try and change something. And I was always drawn to that. And it wasn't an accident that I ended up at a place called Cartemporan Films, which had as its mission sparking democracy through filmmaking. And so it's a very powerful tool to not only bring people together, but to begin a conversation. And this was something I have said over and over again, is that I wanted this film to start a conversation. I know that some people watching it might be upset by it. I know that some people watching it might be uncomfortable or whatever, but I think it's time to have a conversation, because you can never come together if you can't talk about something. And film offers that opportunity in an incredibly powerful way.
Absolutely. One of my favorite films is Italian, actually. It's called Cinema Paradiso. And if you've seen this film, one of the things, and it's a love letter to film, the art making of film and all of these things. But in the film, this kid has to cut all of the like kissing scenes out of the movies. And so it's like this way of censoring kissing and intimacy and pleasure out of it. And so the last, spoiler alert, I mean, the film's been around long enough. If you haven't seen it, you're on clock. So the last scenes in the film, it's like this roll of all of the kisses strung together. Everything that's been cut out of the film. You see them one after another, and they're all brought together. And the film's beauty isn't just that end, but it's the story of that beginning and to the end. And so even knowing that end, it's still a beautiful film to watch. And so as we talk about the things that are left out or what gets shown and what doesn't, Stacey, I'm going to go back to you. One of the things that was interesting as a numbers geek, I was the only high school pom-pom cheerleader girl in my high school, was also in the math club. I love numbers as much as I love sex. And so I loved this part where you talked about PubMed. So one, can you tell people a bit about what PubMed is? But when you talked about the number of articles that appeared about the penis compared to the number of articles that appeared about the clitoris. And because I'm a nerd, I actually calculated this. There are 2,000% more articles about the penis than there are about the clitoris. So can you talk a bit about that, Stacey, and about just talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge, it's a disparity for real. And that's why I made the statement that like biologists don't really care about sex. And when I say that, I mean more so sexual pleasure. Actually, I published a paper not too long ago that kind of categorizes the papers that were published on the clitoris. And of the papers that have been published on the clitoris, well, it was up to 2018, because it was published in 2018. So up to that point, from the 1800s, only the majority of the papers were some sort of abnormality with it, some sort of issue around with people trying to remove it. Very little papers on just the basic biology, like something like 1% of the papers came from just the basic biology on how the structure operates. And what I kind of, what I thought that the reasoning behind that is because the assumption about the functionality of the clitoris is that since it comes from the same developmental tissue as the penis, that we should just assume that the structural functionality of it is the same. But more and more studies, not more, but more studies are showing that there are some structural differences in terms of some of the important proteins that are present on the clitoris versus the penis, which allows them to have functional differences. So there are differences, but the amount of research that's being geared towards them it's not shown, right? I've been trying for some years now to get funding on these projects, and it's a dead end. It's a dead end. Even when I take my students to conferences to present the work, I have to change the title of the presentation so that it seems to be less like pleasure, sex, female. I have to make it so it's more like generic, because if it screams pleasure, sex, female, clitoris, literally the male participants walk by and just keep on moving. Like they don't even stop to read the poster. And my students are the ones who made note of this. They was like, nobody is stopping, right? Like, but once we figured that out, once we started like changing the titles, was more generic or whatnot, people started stopping by or whatnot. But it's still a process, I would say. This isn't a field that you should go in without some sort of strength behind you, because it's kind of lonely. There's not too many people out here who's doing this kind of work, especially from a perspective of like wanting to change this, right? Like wanting to take on the mantle and figuring out what can we do to bring awareness and to change the lives of people with clitorises so that they can have better sex.
Yeah, no, that is so true. And it's interesting that you say the paper, I could go on a whole tangent about MedKini, if you all saw this, about the peer-reviewed journal article about two male identified who published this journal article. They went and they spied on different medical doctors' social media accounts and talked about how unprofessional people in bikinis. It's a whole different conversation we can go into. But what I want to center on is the things you said about the articles that were published were about the problems of it, like, extracting or things like that. We see that a lot in the way that sex education is taught in the United States. So example I often give is, if you took a nutrition class, you wouldn't expect to go there and only learn about Twinkies and ho-hos and fat and all, eating fast food and pizza. You would expect to learn about nutrition. What is it? How do I attain it? And what are some of the aspects that contribute to good nutrition? In the United States, a lot of the sex education programming is about what we don't want, how to prevent sexual assault, how to prevent unintended and untimed pregnancy, how to prevent STD and STI transmission. And we call this education about sex. Where's the consent? Where's the pleasure? Where's the clitoris, right? And so one that definitely needs to change. We need culture change when it comes to that. And when we talk about culture change, Sophia, one of the things that I think is interesting, picking back off of something that Stacey said about the students being the ones who noticed that participants were walking by if they saw female and pleasure and things like that. Pop culture, the art, theater arts, writing, visual arts, pop sports, all of these things do a lot to really change what the actual culture is. And so I'm going to come at my question to you by talking about sports, because I love soccer. So rewind about a decade ago. Mia Hamm, more than a decade, Mia Hamm, fantastic athlete, happens to be a woman, right? There weren't so many men and women being proud to show like Mia Hamm's jersey, right? Like wearing that. Fast forward to now, the number of people of all jerseys who are like, Megan Rapinoe is a kick-ass athlete and buying her jersey and wearing it. Can you talk about the men and people of all genders who are buying this? I believe, let me check my notes to make sure I have this right. It is called the Solid Gold Clit t-shirt. Can you talk about that and what it means when you see people of all men and people of all genders wearing that shirt? Can you talk about that? And two, where can I buy one?
I mean, it makes me so happy. It definitely, I think when I started making the shirts, before I made 100 Laws, I had made an eye chart of clitoracy, and I made my definitions of clitoracy, and I was screen printing them in this art studio in Gowanus, and people kept walking by and they were like, what is that? Can I get that? Like, what is that? Like, I need that. I want that shirt. And I had never had that kind of a reaction with my work before. And I think it just let me know that saying this word, having this word in text, like claiming this part of the body is so powerful. Even just the sound of the word clit, it's very strong. You know, you say vagina, I mean, it's a Latin word that means sword holder. It doesn't include the clitoris. It's only the inside. When you say clit, there's just like a certain force behind it. And the boldness of how the text looks, it turns people's head, it stops them in their track because we're so used to this part of the body only being brought up as a joke or a mystery. You know, haha, you can't find it, you know, oh, I've never found the clit, or oh, my wife doesn't have a clit, you know, these crazy things that are said. So I think, you know, offering something positive, you know, connecting with your point about sex education, offering something that just says like solid gold clit. What does that even mean? I don't know, but I love it and it's resonant, and a lot of people love it too because they keep buying it, and they're still buying it. And I was shocked when I had so many, you know, straight cis dudes wanting to rock solid gold clit. You know what I mean? It gave me a lot of pleasure. And I think that, frankly, I think that there's probably, even if maybe the dominant culture that gets celebrated is really into kind of putting down vulvas and people with vulvas, there is a good chunk of people that love pleasuring their partners, love the clit, love oral sex, love mutual orgasms, love consent, you know? And so offering them something so they can represent, it's kind of great. And so I think, I don't know. I think it's, you know, you never really know who your allies are. And sometimes you just give people an opportunity, an invitation, and you're surrounded and you have way more support than you ever expected to. And I don't know. It just, I mean, I'm thinking of an image in my mind of a dad wearing his solid gold clit shirt asleep with his baby, and like how happy that made me. You know what I mean? When I saw that, and I don't know. But yeah, I still sell them on my website, and it's just called yescliteracy.com. So
yescliteracy.com. I'm going to go there. I want one. I'm also going to tweet out that link after this is done.
Oh, thank
Everyone should wear a solid gold clit t-shirt. If you follow the hashtag #GetCliterate, there may already be a link there to tell you where to buy one, which is fantastic. I love this. So one of the things that I want to talk about, so you're talking about the shirts, the film, cliteracy, all of these things, makes sense to go back to Maria, I guess, to talk specifically about the film. So one of the things, so we talked about Cinema Paradiso, I love that. Another fantastic film is called This Film Is Not Yet Rated. And the film talks about like how desire and pleasure appear on screen and what kind of rating it gets when it's an LGBTQ couple compared to a cis heteronormative couple. What kind of rating does it get when you're showing female pleasure compared to when you're showing male pleasure, or when you're showing to strip genders away from that because men have pussies and women have dicks, right? So it's like, if we talk about genitals, period, because those are separate from each other, gender and genitals. So showing someone be pleased or getting pleasure from a cock compared to showing or someone be pleased with the clitoris. Can you talk about what that representation means? Like, why does it matter? Why do these snowflakes give a shit about whether or not the clitoris appears on screen? Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I can talk about it in the context of how difficult this was to get this film funded, and even to get it in front of people where I could pitch it and where they wouldn't put their fingers in their ears if I said the word clitoris. And what initially, when I began the film, I thought, okay, I'm going to make a film about female sexual desire. I was worn out from trying to raise money for films, and I thought people will throw money at me. And they might have, had I not connected female sexual pleasure with human rights and equality. And so what was most interesting to me as a filmmaker was not that there is female sexual pleasure. That's a part of our humanity as human beings, whatever your gender is, but rather what continued in 2016 when I started the film to get in the way of women, femme-identifying, anybody who was not a heterosexual male in having agency over their desire. That's what was interesting to me. And what was most upsetting was that it was very, very hard to get allies. Sophia was talking about allies to come on and join this film. And so the response that I got from a lot of the gatekeepers in the documentary film world was that this was a film about pornography. Even though there is no porn in this film, nobody has sex in this film, barely anybody's naked. I mean, I couldn't get past that. And it took a long time for me to be able to brand, that's a horrible word, but get people to realize that this was a film about equality and power. And that if you begin with the notion that power is easily taken when the truth is replaced with a lie, I couldn't understand why everybody wasn't on board. And so I grew up Catholic, and so I will speak from that perspective. We're not comfortable thinking about women, people born female, as being sexual. We have the Virgin Mary to thank for that. And so that makes people uncomfortable thinking that women, femme-identifying, might have desire, because they're not really supposed to have desire, right? And that's like not really what you want them to have, because then, as Sophia says in the movie, that's such a powerful thing that their desire is for themselves. That means that woman is truly free. And what the man in the film says, Sophia's friend, is that's deeply threatening to most men. So I believe that until we get beyond that notion that only certain human beings are allowed to experience sexual pleasure and then, in fact, be okay with their sexual desire, that we won't ever get past a patriarchal culture which is misogynistic and racist. And so the difficulty I had in getting this film made was just a microcosm of what's going on in this country.
Yeah, no, this is fantastic. I am going to go to you, Stacey. At first, I've got a question for Sophia because Maria talked about power. And Sophia, you talked specifically about your work and its relationship to power. So I want to go directly to that. But then on deck immediately after that, Stacey, I want to talk about Maria's comment about race and racism and ethnicity and all of these things and how these interplay with a lot of the conversations we're talking about. Don't even get me started talking about WAP, because that's an everyone's.
Oh, we can talk about it.
If we have any opinions about that, we definitely need to be chatting about that too. So that's for you to think about as we go to Sophia, and then you're on deck next, and would love it if you include WAP in there too. Just gonna put that earbud in there. So Sophia, Maria talked a little bit about power, and in the film I remember you said something about all of your work is about how power is represented, and that necessarily and naturally led you to start doing things about sex. That made me think of Oscar Wilde's quote, and I'm paraphrasing, I could not have it exactly, but he basically says, everything in the world is about sex, except sex. Sex is about power. So can you tell me a little bit about your views about the relationship between power and sex?
Yeah, I love this question. I think that we have a very problematic normalization of who is allowed to have sexual pleasure. I mean, who is considered having a right. So, I talk a lot about how female genital mutilation exists in the world. And I think, even if you're not having like the physical harm of this cut made on you, by having an educational system and a media operation that just completely denies this part of your body and shames it. It's kind of like a pedagogical clitoridectomy. But this has happened to hundreds of millions of girls and women around the world. And that elicits basically a shrug. But one guy in America got his dick cut off, John Bobbitt, and we all remember his name. Why? Because the penis is so sacred and protected, and God forbid a man doesn't have the ability to have full access to his pleasure. He can get Viagra if he needs it, no problem. He can have it delivered to his door if he lives in New York. You just text and, you know, they show up and give it to you. Covered by insurance, penis pumps, like, you know, condoms, accessible, free, get them in the night. Meanwhile, God forbid, you know, you talk about young women and people with vulvas having access to birth control, having access to full spectrum reproductive care. It's deeply threatening, and the idea, the audacity that, you know, like I have my posters that say, you know, if you want to fuck us, stand the fuck up for us, because I'm like, where are all these straight dudes who aren't ready to be dads but want to have reproductive sex for pleasure? Where you should be like the #1 abortion rights champion. You know, you should be out there every day at the clinic making sure that people have access to birth control. Yep. Why? Where are you? It doesn't make any sense.
All women, not just the one you knocked up.
That's right. All women. Exactly. And so I really think it's like vital that we link citizenship, full citizenship, to a right to sexual autonomy, agency, and pleasure. You can't have full access to your citizenship if you don't have pleasure. And I think, you know, if you look at the people that have a lot of power in our society, they are fully invested in having all sorts of crazy sexual whatevers. And that's fine, do you, as long as it's consent. But it's very interesting the degree to which some people are trained and, I mean, physically owned. You're trying to talk about institutionalized white supremacy and racism in this country. Black women, I mean, the history of just genocidal rape and harm done to Black women's bodies, and control and policing of Black women's bodies in this country. That's part of the medical system. That's part of the way that, you know, let's talk about Janet Jackson's nipple, how it was policed, and how Justin Timberlake got to have a career and got to be sexual icon. And then she was completely destroyed in that. I mean, that's a perfect parable of how desire is gendered and racialized in our country. So I'll just stop talking, but that's a few thoughts on that.
I love that. It's fantastic. I think that's a perfect segue to go over to Stacey and talk about Black women and sexual desire and all of these fantastic things that Sophia started to kind of point over to you too.
Yeah, so another study my lab is currently working on. So we were looking at the students at the institution that I work at and their experiences with sex education. And one of the things that we found was that a large percentage of the students who identified as being of African descent indicated that they did not have sex education experiences, which was not surprising. And part of that is because the way sex ed the way the education system works in the United States is it based on property tests, right? So a lot of persons of color tend to live in places where they're on a lot of home ownerships, and so the property taxes is lower, and so their schools get poor funding. So it makes sense that you see racial stratification on like the quality of sex ed, or even the absence of it based upon race. But even to bring it into like my own experience as a Black woman, so when I grew up, my mom was real about talking about sex, but like in the sense of like, okay, don't get pregnant. Like, you know, here's the things you need to do, you know, like we can go to the doctor and talk about it. So she never created a space where I couldn't talk to her about like the sex mechanisms, but not necessarily the pleasure. And that's the thing that I find has been missing, right? The pleasurable aspect of like how you enjoy sex, not just the mechanics of not getting pregnant and getting the STD. Like shit, oh, I can curse, right? Because I curse in real life. I
can curse too. It's okay. They'll bleep it out in the post-production if they need to. It's okay.
Right. So like, that was one of the things that I've always found really interesting. But to me as a child growing up, I I was always attracted to the more ratchet music, right? I love, like, growing up, Little Kim, her song,
Yes.
Good Mama
Yes.
Said, I wrote all those words down as a kid, right? I'm hiding it from my mom and I'm reciting it. So I, like me, I'm not like a real prudish person. So like when I hear a song like WAP, especially because like the hook of it, I'm from Baltimore, right? So the hook of it is a Baltimore club song, right? So but to me, it's like cultural, right? I hear that song, it brings me back to my childhood of growing up in Baltimore, Maryland. But one of the things that just really puzzled me, like in the online discussion about this song, like, you know, it's ratchet, but the visuals are beautiful. My God, so beautiful. Like, it's these women owning their own sexuality, saying what they want. I found that, like, obviously the men were like, oh my God, like rappers, like women are talking about their sex. Oh my God. Like, when this is the same kind of lyrics that you all subject us to all the time. Add into drugs, right? Like, it's the same stuff that y'all talk about. But when we talk about wanting to own our sexual pleasure, then all of a sudden it's like, okay, you're doing too much. And I mean, another thing that just really bothered me was like the moral police, right? The folks acting like there hasn't been a history of raunchy music, like throughout time. Like, all of a sudden Cardi B makes a song about the pussy and folks are like, oh my God, this is just way too much. And so it was just really puzzling to me that this was happening. But I mean, I think the overall perception of WAP is that folks like it, right? Like, I think that's overall, folks like it. But I'm down with it. I want one of those.
I'm down with it. And it's funny so much how culture plays a role, because when you said Baltimore, I was like, what are you talking about? There's some hoes in this house like that riff. It's so much time from the percolate. That's Chicago music. That's
well,
there's so much of like, and there's so much of like pop culture and how pop culture is able to play with language and culture and bring people into different things that like we really need to pay attention to, things like the arts in this film, because it's a language of sorts in which you can bring people in. Even from Nelly was the 90s, like going down, down, baby, down, down the roller coaster, was known because we all played and did jump rope to that when we were little girls, right? Little girls and boys played to that. And so there's so much of culture that plays a role, and film was a big part of that. I've got to say the questions are pouring in. We have less than half an hour. So if you have a burning question, if you have burning genitals, it may be a sign of an STI, so that's a different thing. And that we can get testing. But if you have a burning question, throw that to that hashtag #GetCliterate on Twitter or Facebook, wherever in the world you may be. Would love to see people on TikTok using #GetCliterate. Buy that solid gold clit t-shirt and put yourself on TikTok and hashtag that so we can find it and duet it, which would be fantastic. So questions are starting to pour in. We've got less than 30 minutes. So if you have any questions, make sure you get those in right now. Okay, so we were talking about race, gender, culture, the role of film. Sophia, tell me about that book that you published with all that you had a buying war from all these publishing houses that wanted to publish a book about female pleasure. Tell me about your book.
Okay, well, first, I just want to say one thing about WAP, two things. So one is like, how crazy is it that we have a president that can brag about grabbing a pussy, but if women talk about they have a wet ass pussy, it's a problem. And I'm just saying, like, if you are the one who's inspiring a wet ass pussy, you should be so proud of yourself. You should be feeling so good. Like, that is such an honor.
It is.
And it is something to like really celebrate and enjoy. And there's so much ignorance about how pussies actually work. The idea that like, if they're wet, if they're open and juicy, that's a bad thing. That's actually like, that should be the biggest compliment. If it's all dry and like shrunk down, that means she's not into it. She's not feeling you. Like, you're not doing a good job. So I just want to say that because, there's just so much, because we can't talk about these things. There are so many myths that circulate in popular culture. And, I love seeing Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion just like owning it and celebrating it and feeling and like making a beautiful visual metaphor of a wet pussy in that water. Is gorgeous. Absolutely. It's powerful. It's Yamaya. It's like, it's Oshun. It's like the sacred waters, the divine feminine. It's powerful. So I'm all about it.
Absolutely. And yay for all pussies, wet pussies, dry ass pussies as well. as we age, we lose a lot of
Lube is wonderful. Lube
Yeah.
is like, hey,
lose some hydration, that's fine. And women, people of all bodies, if you are a cancer survivor, that is one of the things that happens afterwards. Because I've had women come to me as a sex educator and say, I'm a breast cancer survivor. And then when I talk to my doctor about my vagina being dry and like it being painful to have sex, like, what can I do? To your point, Stacey, she was like, the doctor was like, I don't know, talk to a sex therapist. It's like, you're the doctor too.
You're the doctor.
Why don't you know anything about that? And so we need to do that. So I'm going to go to questions from the audience because they have been fantastic and blowing up our spot with questions. And right before that, I'll say, as we talked about profanity, could we swear or not? George Carlin had a bit about the 7 dirty words you're not allowed to say. Each of those have to do with either an actual reproductive organ, like some orifice from which you would have sex, or a liquid that would come out of one of those orifices. All of it has to do. I won't say them all. Right. Google 7 dirty words you're not supposed to say, and you will notice the high prominence and representation of reproductive health. Okay. Questions. So here's a question from the audience. How do we move away from, I love this question. How do we move away from guilt and shame? How do we lead in a whole way that it's beautiful? So how do we lead in a whole way that it's beautiful? Away from guilt and shame toward beauty. Whoever wants to take that one.
So I'll jump in here because making this film for me they're always a journey, and this was a journey for me as well. And when I started making this film, I joked that I hadn't used the word clitoris in a complete sentence in my entire life. I just used it there. And when I met Sophia, it was a wonderful, and I was pretty old when I met her. It was an amazing experience, both meeting this incredible artist, but also seeing for the first time what my clitoris looked like, right? The whole thing. And what I think people need, what I would love to see people do is normalize the fact that the word clitoris is the medical term for an organ on the body of every mammal-born female, and that there's no shame about that. Are you ashamed about your heart? Are you ashamed about your lungs? No, probably not. So use the word and use it. And I always think that humor is a great way of combating shame. And so that's why I say to a lot of people, well, just your assignment is to use the word clitoris in a complete sentence at least 5 times a day. Because I have a lot of friends who, when they heard I was making this film, they simply said to me, I can't say that word. So I think it begins with language, and it begins with owning that language in a way that feels empowering to you. And ask yourself this. Imagine we taught sex education to boys without ever mentioning the word penis. Doesn't that make you angry? It should.
Yeah.
And so that's an absurd thing because it would never happen. And yet that's the bar that we give for the rest of the population of the world, that we're going to teach you about sex education without ever simply mentioning the organ on your body, whose sole function is your sexual pleasure. Yeah. So I think we move away from shame by one, getting angry that we're supposed to feel shame about the most intimate choices we make as a human being, and that's part of our humanity. And also use humor about it, because it's a great tool to combat the shame.
Yeah, agreed. One of the things they do in our sex ed trainings, when I'm working with our pure health educators that go into schools, is I remind them, like, what's this? We all know this is an elbow. If from the time you're very young, people said, oh, no, call that your bend. You're introducing this language of shame because you know it's an elbow, I know it's an elbow, but you're telling me I can't call it an elbow, which makes me think there's something wrong with my elbow. And so if something's going wrong with the elbow burns, the elbow itches, the elbow smells, somebody touched me on my elbow. I know that I can't talk about it normally the way that I would anything else. And so from birth forward, as you're teaching your children about anatomy and physiology, what their body parts are, your navel, use all of the correct words for everything. So that shame-free education needs to start from birth forward. You talk about it just like everything else. Your child's going to puberty, you pick up some tampons, or you pick up condoms, or you pick up a vaginal cup, whatever you need for them, just like you do your toothpaste. It's not a separate thing. Like, most normal thing. Okay. And all of these questions, it's like Hunger Games here. If you want to answer it, you got to jump on that shit right away because we've got only about like 15 minutes. And what I'm going to do for each of these, I'm going to ask the moderator, not our producer back in person, the magical fairies in the back, to make sure we copy these questions, because I will tweet them out, tagging each of you. So if you have additional thoughts about them, we can make sure that we get those out to everybody. So that was the first question. Question 2, on your mark, get set, here's the question. Are orgasms better when stimulated to occur internally than the stimulation of the clitoris, right? So the idea behind the question is external stimulation better than internal? Because you know the clitoris is internal as well. Like it's the lips, it's all of the stuff. So like, which is better, basically?
Okay, I'll try to answer that one quickly. Just as one of the
Good
answers.
job, Sophia, you jumped right in there. Good job.
There's no better. There's just what makes you feel good. There's no better. What's better? Maybe just do it a bunch of different ways and keep enjoying it and have more fun and have more and more orgasms. You know, there's no limit too. You don't have to. The clit has like this direct blood supply and like way more nerves than the penis, so it can keep having orgasm after orgasm. So have one just with the outside, have one with the inside and the outside, have one this other way, use a vibrator, like enjoy yourself. That is like the most important thing. Unfortunately, there has been such an emphasis that the proper way to orgasm, the mature way to orgasm, the non-pathological way to orgasm, according to Freud, is vaginally only. So if you orgasm primarily through your external clit, there's something wrong with you and immature. That's not true. Whatever gives you pleasure gives you pleasure. But the reality is there's 8,000 nerves on the external portion of the clitoris, on the glands of the clitoris, approximately 3,000 on the glands of the penis. Why would you ignore the place where like most of your nerves are? That just isn't logical. So just do whatever makes you feel good.
Nipples, fingertips, lips, you've got so many nerve endings and so many parts of your body. Your anus, you've got all these places that feel good when they're touched or penetrated. So have fun with them. 100% agree with that. Next question. It was great that you answered that one about orgasms, Sophia. I loved that question about orgasms. And now you all know the sign for orgasms. I love it. Okay, so next question. Most people get their idea of women's orgasms from movies, such as When Harry Met Sally. How truthful are those representations?
I mean, I think
they're mostly lies. You go ahead, Stacey.
No, I think Maria, like they're lies. Like, and it kind of goes towards Sophia's response to the first question. Like, I think in our society, we have allowed media to control too much of our perceptions of our experiences, right? Like, whatever you experience when you're having an intimacy, it's your unique experience. Don't let the media or what you see on television, because they're acting, right, dictate on what it's supposed to look like. I mean, especially like if we want to take it a step further, movies, but even porn, right? Like people use porn often as a guiding principle for how they show up in their intimate settings. Likewise, don't use that, right? Maybe get some ideas, or maybe I'll try this position or whatnot, but don't use it as a standard for what your experience in that space should be.
Love it. We have another question here. How do we move society forward? How do we move society forward on the topic of the clit or female sexual satisfaction, generally speaking, without crossing the PG rating standard? Although the penis is highly regarded in America, the penis isn't allowed to swing around on TV or non-X-rated films generally. Okay, so it sounds like what this question is. It's like, hey, how do we elevate female sexual satisfaction generally without getting out of PG? And they're saying, well, you can't have a dick and just swing that around anywhere that you want to. So how do we actually elevate female sexual pleasure in a way that's still PG is the question.
So nobody is swinging their clit around. Okay, that's first of all an impossible thing to do. This is just about anatomy and allowing half the population to know the truth about their anatomy and their physiology. And that's not X-rated. That's a human right. Sophia said it really well once when we were talking, and she said, if you don't know your own body, you can't feel safe in your own body. And if you can't feel safe, you can't feel free. And so this isn't a matter of X-rated or PG-rated. This is a matter of education about your body. And imagine we don't teach women, bodies born female about their clitoris. Well, what happens if we decide to teach them that, their brains aren't quite right? Because now we can start changing the narrative about other parts of our bodies if we're going to believe that we don't have this organ on our body. So I don't buy that this conversation is X-rated or PG-rated or any of it. I think it's a vital conversation which connects to equality and freedom.
Agreed. Sexy, delicious, gorgeous ass Ewan McGregor had a quote. He did some film, I can't remember which one it was, and he had full frontal in it. I think it was the Pillow Book. Maybe that's the name of it. I can't remember. There was a new theater show called Pillow Man. It was Pillow Book, I think it was called. If it's not that, for sure it was Ewan McGregor. I can't remember which film, but in any event, the film had his full frontal nudity in it. When it was screened abroad, showed like normal, bodies are normal, bodies are healthy. When it came to the United States, they snipped the full frontal so that they can make sure that it's went through and was able to get in. And he has this great quote where he says, well, if I had run around and had a film shooting all these different people and murdering people, like that was the film, that wouldn't have been okay. But I didn't do that. I showed my dick, and that's not okay. So even this idea of like swinging around a dick being inherently X-rated is very cultured. Like the narrative of what sex is and what bodies are, that's a very American script. That's a very American narrative about bodies in and of themselves being vulgar, right? Or warranting an X-rated or, somehow vulgar, obscene thing. Okay, so that one, another question. These are rolling in. We only got 8 minutes, folks, 8 minutes. Okay, another question from the audience. Again, we're down to the wire here. If you have a question, throw that shit in Facebook, Zoom, Twitter, wherever you are with the hashtag #GetCliterate, or tag me, Funky Brown Chick. Find us somewhere online and we can make sure we get your question. Next one. Why do you think only certain kinds of sex are considered obscene? How do we liberate sexuality for those outside of the heteronormative?
Well, I would take this one, or defer to anyone who wants to take it if someone else has more to say about this. But I think that for a long time, the way that sexuality was allowed to exist was solely to satisfy straight, powerful men. And so if you are queer, if you have a vulva, like you are meant to be an object of desire. You are meant to service other people's desire, but you're not allowed to have sexual pleasure or be sexually independent. And if you're not reproducing, like, then there's really no, that's not allowed. So, what is the question? Why? Yeah, I mean, I think we haven't had the means of production to change the narrative. We haven't had funding for the questions, the important questions, like what Dr. Dutton is trying to research. She can't get funding. It's not a coincidence. I mean, we haven't been able to build the buildings. We haven't been acknowledged for our inventions and our research and our creations and our we haven't, we have to write under fake names. I mean, it has not been normalized for us to have pleasure. But that's also a possibility to make such radical change. If we start celebrating pleasure and mutual enjoyment and mutual humanity, then that is going to just completely change our worlds.
Right.
And that's very exciting.
Yeah, agreed. I think so much of it needs to be about, like, again, sex education. I keep going back to education because that's such a big part of it, right? Like, if we actually had education that talked about what is gender expression, what is gender identity, what is sex, hint, it's not just heteronormative, penis insert into vagina sex. What is sex? What is gender? If we had what is sexual orientation, right? If we had these kinds of conversations, we would open up an entire humanity of understanding our ways of being in the world. And we would counter some of the negative outcomes that we associate with things we don't want from sex, untimed pregnancies, for example, which, by the way, lesbian teen girls actually have a high pregnancy rate. Because if we keep using words like birth control to talk about contraception, right, then we're forgetting the fact that there are people who have all kinds of sex that don't relate to birth. And so they're not listening to that and they've tuned out to it. So when you're experimenting or having fun or doing different things with genders that you maybe don't always do, then the lessons that we're giving to lesbian teen girls aren't the same that we're giving to straight teen girls. So we need to talk about barrier methods, period, right? And not just birth control. Okay, so another question. Again, we've got 4 minutes left. Oh my gosh. I'm gonna run. What are the best ways to, I'm gonna take, like host privilege and answer this one. What are the best ways to begin talking to our young daughters and sons about this, educating and empower them? Sex education. As a parent, a guardian, aunt, and uncle, any person who has a young child in your life, you need to be making sure that that child has access to sex education. If you need book recommendations, 2 of the sex educators who are writing books that I would recommend, a friend of mine, Corey Silverberg, writes very inclusive books. There are things like Sex is a Funny Word or What Makes a Baby. Neither of those titles have anything that excludes any gender or any sexual orientation. And the colors of the people in the books tend to be colors like purple. So they're fantastic for everyone. So Corey Silverberg's book, if you need a recommendation, that's fantastic. Another one, Roby Harris, writes a lot of books and has for, I think, 30 years or something like that about sex. It's, it's not the store, like all of these kinds of books from forward. You want to be making sure that children get access to education. If you're like, that's great, books are fantastic, tell me more about websites. Where can I send kids? girlshealth.gov is fantastic for information about puberty, helping girls understand how their body is developing, menstruation, things like that are great. Amaze, A-M-A-Z-E, has a lot of online YouTube series helping parents understand how to have these kinds of conversations, and also age-appropriate videos for young kids. And if your school offers sex education when we can go back to school, and it's not a break for various reasons that we all know about right now, make sure that you advocate for sex education being taught in your school, and that it is taught in a medically accurate, comprehensive way. That is very important to keeping children safe. So if we want these positive sexual outcomes, we need to make sure that we're educating people about sex. Off of my soapbox, on to the next question. Okay, another question, and this will probably have to be the last one, but again, last one for this live thing. And the more it come in, I feel so bad. I feel bad telling people no, unless it's about consent. Then I'll tell people no right away. Okay, here we go. Why is the idea of sexual content so much more taboo in America than, say, in Europe?
Because we were founded by the Puritans.
Yeah.
We cannot get away from it.
Yep. Okay.
So it's the Puritans. We're going to blame them.
Yeah. And I like ending on this question, and then we'll do a closeout, and we'll go around and you guys can tell you guyettes, you fantastic people. Speaking of language, I need to make sure I stop saying things like you guys. It's you wonderful, sexy, you clitoris owning people. Tell us where to find you online. Okay, so this I love as a last question, and I would love everyone to go around and answer it. The question that I'm going to take last, the rest of them need to go on Twitter and Facebook with the hashtag #GetCliterate, and we'll make sure to loop everyone in to answer these. This is the question to end all questions for the evening. What gives you all hope? What gives you hope that things will change in the future and that we will have a better world?
I would say my students give me hope. I'm putting a lot of energy into educating a whole lot of people about this topic, and I see them, they're already moving into career fields where they can implement change, and so they give me hope.
Love that. Maria, Sophia?
What gives me hope are the responses that I get from the film from actually everybody from 16-year-old girls to 80-year-old men. And I've heard so many people say, thank you so much. I can talk to my daughter about this. I can talk to my wife about this. I can talk to my husband about this. And I think there's a wonderful energy in young people today. And it's so much more refreshing than the way I grew up, right? When I grew up, you were either this or you were that, and there was nothing else, right? And now all that's gone. And it speaks to a real openness and inclusion that's what we need if the world's going to change.
I love it. Sophia.
I think, the young people are really pushing these discourses forward. I think it's really exciting to see how people are questioning all of these rules around gender, sex, sexuality, and also the movement for Black lives. Like, I feel like there's so much powerful momentum finally that this is the civil rights movement of our time. And I feel both devastated, but also extremely hopeful that change can happen.
Yeah, I love this. I love this. And my answer for what gives me hope, it's you. You right there who took time out of your schedule to tune in and listen to conversations like this. You are young, you are Gen Z, you're a boomer, you're Gen X, who always gets forgotten about. You live in New York City, you live in small areas. You're watching this on your iPad, you're watching it on your computer. You give me hope because you tune into conversations like this. You buy those solid gold clit t-shirts. You listen to, I call her Stacey, to you, Dr. Dutton. You listen to Dr. Dutton when she talks about the research that needs to happen, and you watch the film that Maria made possible. And so you all give me hope. I'm very, very excited to have you all. And so how can people find you if they want to continue this conversation? Maria, where should people find you?
You can find me through the film's website, thedilemmaofdesiredoc.com. That's the easiest place to find me. I'm not on Twitter very much, but we have a Twitter account, but reach out to me from the website.
Awesome. Stacey, where can we find you?
You can find me at Dr. Stacey Dutton on Twitter. I'm getting a lot better at using social media. That's what you can find me at.
Nice. Sophia, where can people find you and find that shirt?
On Instagram at Sophia Wallace Artist.
Yes, fantastic. I'm everywhere. Funky brown chick, funky brown like the color chick, across everything. I'm online all the time. Thank you all so much for coming. We want to thank our guests, our audience for participating in this call to action conversation. For more of these kinds of things, make sure you check out the film festival that this is part of, which is rePRO, mama.film.org. Thank you all. Love to everyone. Be kind, be beautiful, stroke a delicious clitoris sometime in your life soon. All right, if that's your thing. If it's not, that's good too. All right, thank you everybody. We love you.
Love you. Bye. Thank you.